Research Cluster. I'm really pleased to welcome today Jeff Prager to UC Davis and Freudian Sits. Jeff's a professor of sociology at UCLA. He's an active scholar who publishes work that cuts across sociology and psychoanalysis. He's an analyst with a very active practice in Los Angeles. He heads up the UC Multidisciplinary Psychoanalytic Consortium for all the UCs. Works with people across the world, the US and South Africa in particular, who are thinking and working on memory and trauma and reconciliation and the transmission of trauma across generations. I'm going to stop here because I'm starting to feel lazy just by listening to all these things that you do. But Jeff's work that you will hear about today, doesn't take race, which Jeff says has been organizing American life, politics, and culture at least since Europeans first arrived on the continent, as a stable entity that will and should always exist. Nor does his work claim the U.S. is somehow post-racial, that race doesn't matter, that it doesn't do significant work today. I'll let Jeff make his argument, but it's one that's inspired a great deal of discussion and interest in the several places that he's taken various portions of his work, and yes, controversy too. Just having known Jeff a little bit, I don't think you're the kind of professor who just wants people to nod their head and agree, and I don't think they do, always. Jeff's scholarship on the endurance of race in American life's one. We are thrilled to have the opportunity to have him here to share with us today. But it's not the only reason we're glad to have Jeff present in this talk series. This year we've had scholars give talks who've engaged with psychoanalytic ideas and placed them in conversation with many other texts, practices, and intellectual traditions, from STS to psychology and on. But Jeff's someone who hasn't just studied psychoanalysis, who hasn't just, sort of some of our speakers having had, undergone analysis, but is also, as I said before, a practicing analyst and, a leader in the psychoanalytic community, whether he's assembling and maintaining the principal UC consortium of people and analysts who are working together and thinking about things, whether he's working with those analysts in South Africa, and so on and so on. Jeff's an example of the ways that psychoanalytic practice, as well as intellectual work, can inspire and cross-fertilize with one another. Before Jeff begins, I want to thank Professor Janowitz in particular. Who's personally paying for this. She had to sell one of her many estates for this event. And I also want to thank the programs Religious Studies, Humanities, Hemispheric Institute of the Americas, and Science and Technology Studies, all for contributing to our talk series this year. One thing before we go is that our final talk of the year is coming up this coming week on Wednesday, May 28th. We're in this room at this time, 4:10 p.m. We're going to have food. It's going to be Russian food and Russian drinks. Dr. Laurel Rucker, who's a postdoc scholar in the English Literature Department, will be giving her talk about reading Freud in revolutionary Russia. So it's going to be a great talk, 4:10 p.m. with Russian food. I hope you all come. I want to leave plenty of time for Jeff's talk and some discussion to follow. So please join me in giving Jeff a warm welcome to Davis.
Thank you, Matt. I want to thank Matt for organizing this, making it possible for me to come. I also am very happy to be here to this group in particular, to see psychoanalysis. I don't know if it's alive and well, but it seems to be thriving here at Davis, and I am happy to see the kind of people who are interested in bringing psychoanalytic ideas to their own research and writing. I also, I just want to underscore what Matt had said about the consortium, and I hope you all know about it or will learn about it. The University of California Interdisciplinary Psychoanalytic Consortium, UCIPC. We have a Facebook page and WordPress.com, UC Psychoanalysis, and many graduate students come to the meetings. We offer, you'll see each year we have fellowships for people doing doctoral dissertation research. This year we gave two fellowships for $10,000 for students who are in sort of the last stages of their dissertation, so who are working with psychoanalytic ideas. So I hope you sort of pay attention to that organization. It's graduate students and faculty from throughout the state come to these meetings once a year at the Lake Arrowhead Center. It's a UCLA Center, Convention Center. It's always in May. It's going to be May 1st this year. And in fact, it's a quite an informal group of people, informal presentations, and I presented this material to them just a few weeks ago. Matt was there and has heard this. And I'm happy to present it again. It's a paper that I've just finished writing. I'm still really thinking about lots of these issues. And I thought, though, before I would actually talk about the paper, give you some background, I think maybe as any good psychoanalyst should, of how I arrived at this topic and where some of my, as I understand it, where some of my ideas come from. I have been at UCLA in the sociology department for a very long time. It was my first job. I got my degree in sociology at Berkeley. And when I was in Berkeley, I worked with Robert Blauner, who at the time was doing research. This was in the late 60s and early 70s, and he was doing research on, well, he started by being on the commission on Watts riots in 1965, and then became very involved in the whole question of race in America, and published this book called Internal Colonialism, in which he was using the colonial, and he started by thinking, well, the colonial analogy, that is the work of Frantz Fanon and Sartre and Memmi, may be very useful in better understanding and conceptualizing American racial realities than the models that had operated before. And this book, he wrote it, Internal Colonialism. It's still a very important, good book. He kind of backed away a bit from using the colonial metaphor or analogy to understand American race relations. But I was very much influenced by his work and his thinking. And I wrote and published on the topic of race and ethnicity in America. And even when I went to UCLA, my classes, my first classes for the first 5 or 6 years, I taught race and ethnicity. After I got tenure, I decided to train as a psychoanalyst. And there was a program in Southern California where, in which they financed, they supported, they gave fellowships for academics to train, have a full clinical training in psychoanalysis. And I took advantage of that and then became an analyst. And at that time, my work really shifted away from race. I just really didn't have the time at the time to continue it, and my work took what I thought was really quite a different direction. This program, by the way, is available in Northern California, and Professor Janowitz has just graduated with her degree of full training in clinical psychoanalysis and at the San Francisco Institute. And so you should also think about looking into what's offered at the Psychoanalytic Institutes in San Francisco. But let me just describe a little bit about my work. As after my my training as a psychoanalyst was a second PhD, and I had to write a second thesis. And the thesis became one. It was based upon a case that a woman I was seeing, one of my first control cases, and this was in the late 80s, who came to, in the course of her analysis with me, came to believe that she had been sexually abused by her father. And not only that, but that I was kind of an active participant in her not knowing that and not discovering that. She and really in some ways wanted some license. She wanted some agreement from me, one, that she had been abused, and two, that I was kind of blind to that possibility, and she wanted permission to work somewhere else. it was a very interesting case, a very difficult case. In the end, she and I both concluded that the abuse actually had not happened, and that it was really a product, in many ways, of many of the pressures that was happening in her present moment, in her psychic life, in which there was a strong interest for her to think of her father in as bad a way as possible, to kind of loosen her ties with me. And it was also a time in which, at that very time, there was this moment, I don't know if some of you may be familiar with it, of discovering accusations of sexual abuse in child care centers, and then people almost daily having recovered memory, and it being reported every day. It was circulated all over. I mean, it was really a kind of an epidemic. And in a sense, not to say that these things didn't happen and that there wasn't some memories acquired, but at the time there was no real sense that it's possible to have a false memory, to have it created or generated. And it was only a few years after my work with her that there became what came to be known a false memory syndrome, and there was a foundation committed to understanding that sometimes memory isn't reliable, and that memory, in fact, can betray us. So my book, actually, that book was called Presenting the Past, and it was really about the forces in the present, her present, and in the cultural, socio-cultural present, that created a kind of a force field for her to have these memories and then to alter them. But that book led me to a set of questions, more sociologically, which was the idea that I realized that there were whole societies who were in some ways trying to make sense of their own traumatic pasts and come to terms with them and be able to live beyond it, not to be completely weighed down. And of course, at the time, what I was thinking of was South Africa, where South Africa, the end of apartheid in 1992, 93, there was the development of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, in which it said, we're going to have this moment of testimony, of acknowledgement of what happened, of confession, of expressions of anger, and that process itself is we're going to try, the goal was, the aim was, we're going to try to demarcate a past that we're ashamed of and a future that we're moving toward. And only by, in their mind, only by having something quite extraordinary in which people would, it was almost like time stopped for a while when the TRC was operating. It was broadcast all over the country. It was a kind of collective process of taking stock of a past so as to move forward. Now, of course, South Africa still has many, many problems, and it didn't cure everything, but I think it's safe to say that it played a role in there being a more stable, less vengeful politics in South Africa than there might have otherwise been. Okay, so I became interested in the whole topic of apology, forgiveness, reconciliation as a kind of a political strategy and as a strategy of dealing with the past. So I took what was my work in psychoanalysis at the individual level and tried to think about it more globally and collectively. And then, and I wrote a few things about South Africa, and then I was asked talk, this was a few years ago in Australia, about American race relations and try to think about it psychoanalytically. There's a conference that was like this group trying to use social science and psychoanalysis in a creative way. And so I actually turned back to my work on race, and I felt, it was really actually a terrific feeling. I realized how much I had actually, as a graduate student, how much you learn, how much you have to read and know, and how much information and literature you acquire. And all of this was really had been gone. I hadn't been using it very much, and that sort of all came back to me, including the work of my professor, my mentor, Robert Glauner. And so this paper is actually a product of this kind of bringing together my early work on race and ethnicity and my psychoanalytic training. It was the first time I really tried to think about American racial realities through using some psychoanalytic lenses. So so the paper, as you see, Matt provided copies that through the email. After I sent them to Matt, I read this little note at the top of the first page, which says to the author, these are the page proofs, in which I'm supposed to edit for minor grammatical, for corrections and all. But it says, but under no circumstances may the file be distributed or otherwise made accessible to any other third parties without the express prior permission of the press. So you all have, what's the word? Illegal, I guess that's the word I'm looking for. So anyway, you can use the paper. You're certainly free to read the paper, but don't blanket the campus with it if you don't mind. Okay, so let me just talk a little bit about what I try. There's a lot in the paper. It was really me trying to work it all through. I actually think on reflection there's too much in the paper and that I could actually break it into parts. What I'm going to do today is try to summarize the argument I make, but focus specifically on the part that has the more psychoanalytic dimension to it. And I'm happy to entertain questions or comments. Just let me get started with the argument, and at some point when it seems appropriate, and if you want to break in with a question, you should feel free to do that. I also teach at UCLA in the sociology department. I teach social theory, and every year I've taught both Foucault and I've taught Bourdieu. And I'm doing that this quarter. And as I do it again, I've done this for about 6 or 7 years, I'm impressed by how much what I've taught of Foucault and Bourdieu has kind of become part of my way of thinking. And you'll see that, and if I isolate that in a way, you'll see that reflected in the paper. So I start, essentially, the first part, talking about racial inequality in America. I basically use an argument that Foucault uses in his History of Sexuality, in which he says we are all led to think. He talks about it as the repressive hypothesis. We're all led to think. The discourse that we all share in is a discourse that there was once a time in the Victorian era in the West in which sex was not talked about. There was shame about it. People were embarrassed about it. And since then, things have gotten better and better and better. And that there's more openness, there's more discussion, and that things are improving. People are less ashamed about variation and diversity, et cetera, et cetera. And he calls it the humanistic fallacy. And what he means, what Foucault means, is that what's actually happened is that there's more and more pressure on the individual to declare himself or herself sexually, to define it. It's a kind of a form of discipline. That's Foucault's idea. It's a form of having to figure it out and give a word to it. Well, I argue in this paper that we have about race relations in this country. We have a similar humanistic. We operate with a similar humanistic fallacy, which is, with respect to African Americans in this country, things were certainly very bad, pointing to slavery, and that over time things have improved, and that things are getting better and better, and after all, we have an African American president now. So how can we argue that things are improving? But I argue at the first part of the paper, all you have to do is change the lens a little bit. And if you look at the issue of inequality between whites and blacks, there's been very little change in terms of various measures of inequality. That despite the abolition of slavery, and despite the end of Jim Crow, and despite the implementation of the Civil Rights Acts in the 1960s, and despite the election of Barack Obama, the gap between white and black has remained remarkably constant on just about every measure you can think of. Unemployment, poverty, income, wealth. I mean, and there's some variation, and sometimes it's a little better than others. But basically, we have a society stratified. And we've always had a society stratified by white and black as the explicit categories of distinction. And I argue in this paper that this notion that things are getting better actually sends us off in the wrong direction in a way. We are continually thinking, well, how do we improve the situation for African Americans? What kind of initiatives? What kind of policies? What kinds of things can we do in housing and schools and in every institution? And I'm not suggesting that needs to stop or should stop those kinds of questions about improving the condition of African Americans in the country. But the sense that we're closer now than we were is actually makes us understand the problem of race differently, I argue, than we should. So this is how the kind of argument I try to make. I suggest that we're all caught in a kind of a paradox of discussion and talking about race in America, because all of us will simultaneously say something like, we understand that race has no material reality, that since Ashley Montague, we all agree it's a specious category. It doesn't explain what it's supposed to explain. And because there's too much interaction between groups and et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, people who are interested in the topic are constantly looking at the difference between blacks and whites and measuring blacks and whites. And so it's a real paradox, because how can you study it without in some ways reinforcing the speciousness of the category? We treat it as real, and in fact, of course, people are treated as if it were real, but it's the category itself that I try to argue, which is the problematic. And if you look at the category of race, I'd say the words black and white have not changed since the first Africans and the first Europeans came together in the United States. And there was a presumption then that there was a real, durable distinction between Europeans and Africans. That is, we were talking about two different, almost, kinds of people. That there was a fundamental conviction, almost and it was naturalized, a fundamental conviction that we're talking about two groups of people, and that and it came to be, over time at least, maybe not originally, those two different kinds of people were whites on the one side, that is the Europeans, and blacks on the other, that is the Africans. But the category has persisted. I mean, the category of whites has persisted in a way that suggests that something else is going on beside an issue of Europeans and Africans, because the category of white continues to expand. Who's white now, who's considered white, and who considers themselves white now, it's not, you don't have to demonstrate lineage to the Pilgrims to call yourself white. In fact, just about every group outside of Africa and Asia, but even Asians is a bit more problematic, think of themselves, identify themselves as white. So at one time, at the beginning of the 20th century, Italians, Jews, Greeks, Southern Europeans they were considered other. And yet they, in some ways, partly by their performance, how they proceeded, and partly the way they were perceived, now become white and identify as white, think of themselves as white. And when they hear the story of the Thanksgiving story, they say, even though I'm from Poland, the Pilgrims, they're my people. And then there are the Africans, the blacks. And that group has changed. At first was, of course, it was the African slaves. But then in the South, there were all kinds of designations between African, pure bloods, mulattoes, octoroons, high yellow, and they each had their separate kinds of forms of treatment. And there were separate kinds of ways of engaging in it. Now, of course, and Barack Obama can't be a better example of this, of the one-drop rule. Now, you have one drop of African blood, you're black. So we talk about our African-American president. But of course, we know his story. I mean, if we want to be precise, we're being very imprecise by calling him African-American. So the argument I make, really, is that, in the first part, is that this is actually a socially constructed category that continues to change over time, but remains absolutely naturalized. That is, we still experience one another, black and white, as different types of people. I mean, not all the discourse says that. We say everyone's created equal and everyone's entitled to equal protection, all that. But in terms of encounters, we actually still think about blacks, however we define it currently, and whites, however we define it currently, as possessing different capacities, abilities, talents, body types, is Matt actually directed me to this book on the durability of race in medicine, a PhD dissertation showing the way in which the medical practices is, well, we have African American health and medicine for African Americans, and we have health for Anglo Americans. It goes on and on and on. And in fact, there was just a couple months ago, NPR had a story of a graduate student from Harvard finishing his dissertation. I don't, it might have been in psychology, but it already made news. It was called Racial Empathy. I don't know if any of you have heard this, but it was a study of asking people, I can't remember exactly how it was conducted, but the issue was, do black people and white people experience pain differently? Pain.